Hey everyone, it's your favorite cynic and critic, the Gov here, thanking you for tuning in to this episode of Scarifyer featuring our guest host, Jeremy Beaudette, a true gentleman and horror scholar, especially in the subgenre of splatter films. Unfortunately, though, this episode has one of those very inconvenient technical problems. The last 10 minutes of the episode cuts out for some reason due to unforeseen circumstances beyond our control. We don't know what's going on, but don't let that stop you because it didn't stop us. So kick back, relax, and enjoy Scarifyer.
Oh my. No. No one can get themselves in that kind of position.
Sure they can. Just keep watching.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Wrong porn, guys.
Oops.
It's torture porn on Scarifyer.
Scream for your life! To a new world of gods and monsters.
Oh, yes, you psychos. Torture porn this week on Scarifyer. I am the Ace,
I am the Gov.
And I'm Quinn.
and you are in the house that psychos built. We have a fun show for you guys today. We actually are going to have a guest host. And because of social distancing, we did pre-record the show. But I would like to introduce to you a good friend of ours. His name is Jeremy Beaudette. He is actually a former host on the YouTube series Wrestling with the Business. And you can also listen to him right here on Anchor on Just My Opinion with Ken Lambert.
It was actually a really good conversation. It was a nice second part of our call-in interview thing that we've been doing lately. But the guy went on and on. It was really insightful. He loved this subgenre.
It's okay. I got a nap in. It's fine.
Yeah, definitely a great conversation, engaging conversation, and I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. So with that, it's showtime. Jeremy, you are in the house that psychos bit. How's it going, dude?
I am excellent. Enjoying my quarantine.
Aren't we all, right? So, all right. Well, so let's get right into this. We're talking torture porn / Gorno. Let's start off with where the term came from. Now, it's under my understanding that the film critic David Edelson actually used the term first in describing Eli Roth's Hostel. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, it was. It was. It was actually used as a little bit of a put down. I think in the beginning. I think it's, at least in my opinion, it's a bit of an oversimplification of the genre. I think that I think his intention was to, in one word or less, to try to find a way to communicate all the things that he really didn't appreciate about that particular style of film that had been around for probably his entire lifetime, certainly dating back to the early 1960s, dating all the way back to the 1930s, even if you consider some of the morality movies that were being put out back to the earliest days of Hollywood. So I think that initially he used the word as a bit of in a derogatory way. And I think, unfortunately, that sort of stuck. And I think the use of that term sort of, and the catchiness of it sort of pigeonholed the genre in a way that I think created a lot of success initially for the genre. A lot of the, splatter films from the early 2000s, a lot of names that I'm sure we're going to be using here today, had extremely low budgets, $5 million or less for a major Hollywood film. And they made, 10 or 15 or 20 times their initial investments, but then it burned out very quickly. And I think a lot of the public became extremely tired of it, and they sort of looked at it in a very simplistic way. And what they came to find out is, that's just sort of the enthusiasm started to burn out as a result of that.
So what would you classify it as?
I prefer, it's, so if I was to try to define it, I would say I prefer using the term splatter film. I think the downfall of using that term is that is it's a much more general term. It's a much wider term that encompasses way more films. I mean, when we picture Gorno in your head, I think people picture tits and intestines. Right?
Well, yeah. I mean, like I hate the term like torture porn, and I never use Gorno, but like torture porn, like I feel like, so was somebody gonna pop in like a BDSM movie or
like a snuff film or something?
yeah, 50 Shades of Not Great. Like,
I think that. I think that that's a serious disservice. I think I prefer to think about it like a really good splatter film uses violence the same way that films often use sexual content, right? It's designed to get the same response from the audience, right? It's a physical act, right? I mean, if you think about it, it uses the extremely graphic portrayals of violence to sort of display this vulnerability that the human body has, right? And there's this closeness, and oftentimes there's this intimacy between victimizer and victim. It's extremely unique. I mean, and you can even see in the way that it's shot. A lot of the directors and the filmmakers use a lot of the same techniques during the torture scenes of the films that they use during the sex scenes of love films. I mean, if you're just looking at a shot for shot, a description shot for shot, it's tough to tell, the torture scenes from Hostel from Dirty Dancing. I mean, it's the same techniques in the same order in the same way.
Jeremy, buckle up because Quinn has something to say.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and use that analogy that you just gave us between Dirty Dancing and Hostel. The dispute that I have with that is Dirty Dancing was more suggestive. And yes, it did show more than at that time what normally they were allowed to show. But like Hostel left like nothing to the imagination. Now, Hostel went right in there. It punched you square in the face, didn't apologize, as opposed to Dirty Dancing where your brain kind of does a wonder what that is type idea. Almost like an allurement, as opposed to, like I said, something like Hostel being aggressive and being like, well, this is what we're going to do and this is what you're going to see. No imagination. We're straight to the point.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely some validity to that. My comment was mostly surrounding the techniques of filmography, right? Drawing a link between the director trying to portray the intimacy between two consenting adults, right, in a sex scene, versus one consenting adult performing an extremely physically intimate act. It's a pure technique. All I'm saying is that they're using the same tools. I think that, keep in mind, Dirty Dancing did not shy away from controversial. Baby's age, right? Baby is not a 30-year-old woman, right? They address the topic of abortion quite directly in that film, right? There's a reason why Baby has to dance, right? And that's because the previous dancer is off getting an abortion because she's pregnant and she can't come back and dance. So that's certainly not to say that it's the same thing. But what I'm saying is films in general good films always tried to address a controversial topic. Dirty Dancing was not meant for a subgenre of horror. So it didn't smack you in the face with it, right? They didn't bash you over the head with it the same way that a film like Hostel does. The message is a little bit different. But if you want to get people's attention, you have to address a controversial topic of the day. And I think in a film like Hostel, the controversial topic that was trying to be addressed was the ignorance of the American tourist post 9/11, right? This is the view that people around the world had of the American male, certainly the young American male, of, these ignorant hornhounds that are just out to get high and bang as many prostitutes as they can. And this is the comeuppance, right? This is the trap that you're going to fall into when you're just chasing pussy and not caring about anything, right? It's a critical look at the exploitative culture of America when put on the international stage. And we see that these men that are running around chasing these women, right, and trying to physically chase these women end up being taken advantage of themselves in an extremely physical way, right? And so there's this weird juxtaposition that violence that smacks you over the head with really shines a light on that extra violence. And by the way, one other comment I wanted to make to what you said, Quinn, which I think was good. It smacks you in the face, but they're actually, if you go back and look at it shot for shot, and I did, and I'm quite familiar with the film, there actually isn't as much actual violence as you think in it. There's a lot of implications of violence. There's a lot of snapping of scissors and revving of chainsaws and that kind of stuff. But the actual on-screen violence is not nearly as much as you might remember going back afterwards. I mean, you're really only looking at a few minutes of total violence. The rest is all done through noise and clever camera work and implication and inference and all those other kinds of things.
Right, but that shock value is what hits you in the face. That's kind of what more point I was going after.
Yeah, I think that highlights, I think that it raises the stakes. Right. And I think in a good splatter film, and this is why I like the Roth films more than I like a lot of the others, because Roth in many ways does the work. I mean, when we watch The Green Inferno from 2013, that plane crash happens. They don't crash in the wilderness until 40 minutes into the movie? 40 minutes into the movie?
Yeah, it takes a while to get to it. Yeah.
The same thing with the Hostel films. The first half of the movie is basically a snooze fest. I mean, I remember the first time I watched it in 2005, I was like, I almost fell asleep, before they finally dragged him into that factory. And I think that it smacks you in the face when it hits you, but nobody's surprised, right? Nobody's surprised as they're wandering into that factory, or as in Hostel Part 2, when all of a sudden all of her friends start disappearing and then these strange men start chasing after her. You know what she's in for, right? You know what's there. It raises the stakes. If they were to just come out and punch you in the face right out of the gate, then you've already taken it to 10. And how do you spinal tap that up to 11, right? You can't really do it. You've already given away the goods. But a good director like Roth, he leads you into it. He does it in a way that doesn't make you sympathetic to the characters, which might be a cost on his part of him trying to be actually critical of the characters in the film. He doesn't want you to feel particularly sympathetic, so that instead of feeling sad for them that they're never going to see your kid again, you're just sad that they're having their arm cut off or their fingers cut off or they're feeling this pain or whatever. But in the end, the stakes are still high. You're still there. You're still grabbing your chair. You're still sweating, and you're still having that same visceral reaction to what's going on the screen in front of you.
I mean, you make a good point. You do. I'm thinking of two movies, in my personal opinion, nobody has to like it, that I feel don't drag in the beginning. Final Destination is one that gets your attention and it keeps you there. And the other one that I'm thinking about is Saw. Saw makes you go, what the fuck, from the very second. that Carrie Elwes wakes up, and it gets your mind going from the very beginning, as opposed to dragging on and on and on, and then full throttle right at the end.
Mhm.
Well, I'll say to a point with those films, at least and I don't even know if I would consider them a part of the
I don't necessarily keep them
films
part of
or-
the splatter films, but as far as like pacing is concerned.
But what I will say is what they do with those characters is you are invested in those characters. You actually get a chance to get to know them and sort of feel sorry for them, where Jeremy just said that Roth doesn't concern himself with that. It is kind of a comeuppance kind of, cautionary tale, which isn't unlike the slasher films of the 80s.
Right.
You know what I mean? Just, I guess, more in a realistic tone.
Comeuppance.
Yeah, you don't have a guy with a hockey mask anymore. You have a person in a swimmer's cap and an apron.
Also kind of like the 2019 Invisible Man type idea.
Let it go.
No, I will never let it go. That movie made me so angry.
I think there's an interesting point there in that, even if you look at the Saw films, and I would say that Saw is more splatter than any other genre. I think it definitely dips its toe in multiple genres and subgenres. But it definitely, the same thing as like the film Seven, right? Like, okay, you look at a film like Seven, you're like, okay, it's a Fincher film. It's extremely dark, definitely like,
and extremely boring.
It's got a lot of, it's got a heavy violent component to it, but you don't actually see a lot of violence in the film. There's not a lot of actual violence there. So that would be one that I would say kind of skirts the edges. But a film like Saw, one thing that does that's quite interesting in relation to primarily the work of Eli Roth is that it presents you with heroes that are extremely faulty. Just like our quote unquote heroes from Hostel and from The Green Mile, they're heroes that do bad things, that don't have good intentions, that are exploitative. You see, as Jigsaw says, he does not capture church choir boys, right? These aren't women that are out handing out dirty needles to drug dealers and clean condoms to prostitutes. These are people that have their own checkered histories. And you find yourself in a position where you're actually cheering for the person that in almost any other film context would be the villain, right? This is the drug dealer. This is the guy that's done bad stuff. This is the whoever, taking it back to Dirty Dancing, right? This would be the guy that you wouldn't be cheering for in the corner. I'm sure that any single one of the kids inside the Eli Roth films or inside the Saw movies would be members of Cobra Kai. There's no two ways about it. But I love Cobra Kai. but I think that in that way, that genre, because of the extreme nature, right? Because of the extremity that visceral violence takes you to, it allows you to provide more nuances in different places of the plot line, in different places of the structure, and the characters themselves. You don't have to have black and white, right? Like that Cabin in the Woods film where it very blatantly lays it out, right? She's the virgin, he's the jock, blah, 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 blah. You don't have to stick to that structure because the stakes are so high that everything below it gets completely reorganized. And I think it gives you a lot of freedom to play with the characters. The trouble is that in an American film that's 90 minutes long, you don't have the time that you need to truly explore the intricacies of the character. And so you end up taking away from the violent aspect, which pulls you out of the splatter film genre, like a film like Seven would do, where we learn a little bit more, right, about the Kevin Spacey character, the Brad Pitt character, the Morgan Freeman character, and there's a lot more character development. Or you end up throwing yourself way in the other direction where there's no character development whatsoever, like, the Serbian film or, some other crazy film like that just goes completely in the other direction. And it's more like, okay, can I keep my lunch down? There's just not enough time to do what you need to do, I think.
Well, what's the appeal of these type of movies? Because from a general audience perspective, I mean, back in the day when these movies were coming out, everyone was just drawn in by the allure of the special effects. So would this be more of a special or practical effects display it as opposed to a movie that has a storyline or a narrative to it. Because you get everybody in the cinemas going like, oh, you got to check out Saw or you got to check out Hostel and how they kill this guy in the most creative, disturbing way possible.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that, I think that the appeal is different for everybody. I think that there's no doubt that there is a particular percentage of the viewership that is just, sadistic, Dennis Rader, Jeffrey Dahmer, type people. I think that there is a group of people that are like that. I think that there is another group of people that are there just to see if they can keep their lunch down. They're there on a dare. Can they get through it? Can they not get through it? I think that really only represents, 10% on the bottom end and let's say 10% on the top end. I think that the middle 80% are people that are dragged there by people on either end of the spectrum because there's a, and this goes back to using the term Gorno. People go in there expecting to see one thing. And then when they find that the onion just has a second layer, if there's just a little bit of complexity, a little bit of nuance, a little bit of interest, it's like everybody's expectations were so low because they were just expecting to see somebody chained to a chair and have their head cut off. That everybody's just so overly impressed. This is why Saw was such a box office hit, because when they realized that not only were there good special effects, but there was actually some drama to it, right? There was actually some suspense. There was actually maybe a little bit of comedy, right? And you got that same, people didn't expect to see that kind of film the way that it was marketed and the way that it was advertised originally. So just by overachieving in that little bit, it created this environment in which, and then of course it becomes this cult hit, right? Now everybody remembers being Saw because everybody was 14 when they got to see it. And it just blew them away with the level of complexity. Yeah. And to the 14-year-old mind, a plot like Saw and the moral ambiguity of the characters inside it was extremely interesting.
Well, I mean, when you talk about, I agree with you to a point with Saw. I mean, the complexity and the characters were there with maybe the original trilogy.
Yeah,
the first
after
two,
that,
but when you get into
the first two, yeah.
I mean, when you get past into multiple sequels, it really does just become look how we killed this guy and look at the twist we cooked up for the ending to keep you coming back.
Exactly.
Almost like a cliffhanger, like in the Batman series.
Yeah, I don't, and I think we all should do this. I think that, once you get beyond once you vary from the original director, a lot of the original cast, you're creating an entirely different animal. You really can't judge. I'm not going to judge Land Before Time 10 the same way that I judge Land Before Time. You just can't. You can't treat it the same, and that goes across any genre. And
that took a really weird turn, guys. Land Before Time that ruined me as a child. Thanks, Jeremy.
That's the true horror.
My
film.
God.
So I think.
Welcome, children. Let's talk about death, okay?
What? His mama dies. He's got to overcome something. Jeez, come on. So I think, my goal is to pepper as many children's film references in this horror movie conversation as I can. So two down. I think across all genres, you can't judge the third movie the same way you judge the first two. Especially in the horror genre, it's especially bad in horror and animation. And that's because they're cheap to make. So production companies see it as a cash grab. They know that they could go direct to DVD, that 10 to 20% of the sadistic population is going to invest in it, and they're going to buy the DVD and they're going to rent the film because they just are dying to see what happens next. And as long as they only spend $250,000 on the film, then they're going to make their money back. And to them, it's a good investment. It keeps the lights on. That's really the only reason why you saw Saw 6 and Hostel 3 and all those other films. And then they're just running out the clock because in another 10 years, they're going to be like, hey, wouldn't it be great to revisit the Hostel films? Hey, wouldn't it be great if we redid whatever? Because they're just running out the clock. They're just trying to keep things going. So I think you're right. I think that there's a half-life. There's a half-life on every story. And I think that because of the intensity of the splatter film genre in general, yeah, that half-life is going to run out correct. It's going to run out really quick. And I think you can't get any more than 1 or 2 films. I think Hostel Part 2 is really only half as good a film as the first one is. So I'll give them 1.5. But yeah, I think.
I mean, essentially the same film, just with female characters.
I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. I think that Eli Roth did say something unique and interesting, not just about the human nature of the victims in Hostel Part 2, but about the human nature of the perpetrators as well, right? These are the people that do this. And there were some interesting, unique twists in there. But like I said, you can only get, because it had recycled roughly half the plot from the first movie, you only get half of a good movie. Right, and then Hostel Part 3 is a half of that half. And it's the same thing with the Saw films. It's the same thing with all of them. The half-life is just too short.
So I'm going to backtrack for half a second. In your opinion, do you consider Seven a splatter movie?
No, I would say that one, it definitely skirts the edge, but there is not enough actual violent, because there's really not very much violent content at all in that film. But I think that you add 1 or 2 violent scenes in there, and I think it would certainly qualify as an exploitation film. But unfortunately, there's not enough gore for it to qualify.
All right, well, and then that's actually where I was going to lead the conversation. What qualifies as a splatter, torture porn?
Yeah.
What qualifies a movie for that? And further on that, does it even have to be in the horror genre per se? I mean, you look at some of these war movies with all the gore, or any Mel Gibson epic, for that matter. What's the qualifications?
That's actually a really good question, because I think that you might find a scene in a suspense film or a thriller film that might be a splatter scene. I'm thinking about the torture sequence from Law Abiding Citizen. No one in their right mind is going to say that that's a splatter film, or that that's even a horror film, but there could be no doubt that is direct out of the
Well, that's definitely a sequel.
That's an exploitative sequence. So I think that even people that, and I think that the success of a film like that relies on the stakes being that high. If he doesn't get his revenge like that, and if you don't see it in the beginning, if they just find the body, if you just jump cut and you don't find out that he had all these, he had all these devices set up, and he had adrenaline there so that he wouldn't pass out, and he had extra blood, and he had, if you didn't, then that takes away from the intensity of the sequence. It takes away from the intensity of the film. It sort of milk toasts the character. Oh, this guy really isn't that committed. He's really not all that into it. And it flattens the character out. So I think that you can use a lot of those same themes to really enhance other films across the genre. And you can see the same film type techniques. I mean, let's take a film that's, I think, way out of left field compared to this. Let's take 007 Casino Royale with Daniel Craig. Okay. The torture sequence towards the end of the film, right? There's no blood, right? But it's the same scenario. It's the same. He's naked in a chair. He's tied to it. There's a hole in the bottom of it. They use shadowing in the sequences the same way that they use it in the Hostel films, the same way that they use it in Seven, the same way that they use it in the Saw films. And the idea is to set a mood, right? Every shot has a purpose behind it. And the idea is to set a mood, and that mood drives the intensity up, right? You spend the whole film, you're stressed out because it's action sequences. Then you're stressed out because he's playing cards and it's for $1 gajillion, and a terrorist is going to bomb a whole bunch of people if he wins this money back. So you're stressed out over that. And now you're stressed out over the actual physical, the actual bodily, physical, and frankly, kind of graphic. In 007, it's not quite as graphic. It's a little bit more nuanced, should we say. But, I think that it's still there. So the types of films that classify like directly as a splatter film, you have to have direct violence. You have to have direct, visceral, graphic violence in order for it to truly be considered a splatter film. If you're not looking at internal body parts, if you're not seeing buckets of blood, if you're not, if there isn't pain associated with it, then you're definitely not dealing with a splatter film. And like I said, there are modern day films that ride the edges. And there are even some films that I think you can argue about. I'm thinking about The Hills Have Eyes, The Last House on the Left. There's some controversy over whether we would consider The Devil's Rejects and House of a Thousand Corpses, because those are kind of grindhouse style films, which sort of fit into the subgenre. Do they count or do they not count? But I think for the most part, I think it's just that one category alone, just having explicit, consistent graphic violence, which is designed to elicit the same response from you as the viewer that you would get from a sex scene, right? That same physical feeling that you get, that is what the director is trying to get out of you.
Would you consider, for example, like the Nightmare on Elm Street movies?
No.
Splatter?
No.
No, I mean, they're extremely graphic. I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, the marionette scene, is probably one of the most gross scenes in
The opening
the genre.
Scream, for God's sake, she's hanging by her intestines.
I think I don't think that there is enough of it. Yeah, I think you can make the same argument with Hellraiser, right? But I think that because there's a lot of particular graphic moments, but I don't think that those films rely on the fascination with the vulnerability of the human body. I think that splatter films are exploitatious in nature. They have to have exploitative themes. And I think that Nightmare on Elm Street really doesn't carry that same theme, right? From 7, they talk about the pound of flesh, nothing more, nothing less. In Hostel, we talk about the exploitation of buying people, right? The same way we talk about human trafficking and human sex trafficking. These guys have essentially been human trafficked across the international border, and now they're being physically taken advantage of the same way that they wanted to physically take advantage of the women that they're after over there. It's the same kind of idea. It's the same kind of structure. And I think that if you don't have that same vulnerability of the human form, and you don't have to have that same type of theatricality, I just don't think that it fits. And I think that most of Nightmare on Elm Street is built around, the slasher. It's built around, yes, there are extremely, because in order to try to lengthen that half-life, a lot of times directors that are doing the 3rd or 4th or 5th movie will use more explicit violence to try to drive that same type of stakes into it. Because we've already seen Freddy. We already know who Freddy is. Why would we go back for, we want to see what he's going to do next. And you see it in every film. I mean, the original Poltergeist film had one sequence that was bloody and disgusting, right? And it was all inside a guy's head where he tears his face apart in the mirror. And then by the 3rd one, you got all this crazy stuff happening because they're just trying to raise the stakes. It comes off as very inauthentic. Deaths aren't earned. Plot development isn't there. And in the end, they're just, again, like I said, they're just trying to run out the clock. They're just trying to get to the next step.
So basically what your point being is, it is vulnerability of the human body that is manipulated and mutilated in a way that almost strikes a chord.
Yeah, I think it has to be. I think the other thing is that it has to be graphic. It has to be graphic.
Right. So then that means that you could also lump body horror to a degree into that same category?
Yeah. I mean, I think that they're, I'd say that they're close relatives. Again, you get down into these subgenres and subgenres and, whatever. I think that there's a lot of overlap between the genres. I've already mentioned myself, the exploitation films from the 1970s ride the edge. The cannibal films from the 1980s, they ride the edge. The zombie films from the 1970s and 80s. I think once you get down into the subgenre, there's a lot of overlap. But I think that, go ahead.
Well, I mean, definitely, this kind of movie has its roots, especially in Italian cinema with the Mario Bava films, but would you consider this a actual subgenre or a subgenre?
Would I split one hair or two hairs? I'm not sure. I think that I would say, to keep things simple, I would say it's a subgenre. The same way I would categorize it, the same way that I categorize a slasher film, right? There are certain canonical works that are associated with that genre that everybody knows. There's 1,000 other works of minor import that recycle a lot of the same techniques and tools and themes that the canonical works do. And I think that it's large enough, especially nowadays. I think that it's large enough, especially when you consider the scope of international films. The French, God, they're bloody disgusting. The Koreans, holy crap. The Serbians, for the love of God. I think that once you encompass the international scene, you develop a body of work that is large enough and unique enough to be considered its own subgenre.
So where do you think the downfall of it lies? How, for a brief time, especially in the early 2000s, we saw a lot of these movies and a lot of copycats come out. And then all of a sudden, turning off a light switch, it was over.
I say overexposure.
Overexposure, that could be a good one, but
everybody did it.
Or was it, we've seen this before, but even something like the slasher genre didn't last nearly as long.
Right.
Or have a resurgence where, let's make these movies.
It seems to me that, and I'm using a broad generalization here, but it seems to me like you can't get really any more than 10 good years out of a genre. It seems like there's some canonical film that sort of begins things. And a few years later, it catches fire, and a whole bunch of other directors and a whole bunch of other production companies are interested in investing and exploring that genre. You come up with a half dozen or so really cool, really unique pieces of work that become, cult classics in their own right or mainstream successes. And then you come up with 2 to 5 dozen other minor pieces that, you're really only interested in if you're a big fan. And then it burns out because the horror genre in general, like every other genre, is a transforming genre. I mean, every generation has its own tastes. It has its own interests. It has its own we talk about the Overton window, right? That's the window in which the acceptable forms of communication take place. And that Overton window is constantly shifting, right? We're talking about John Denver and Dee Snider going before Congress to defend the right to say fucking shit on a CD, right? And, that was just in the early 1990s. Well, the Overton window shifted 10 years later into the early 2000s. And now we're talking about being able to view a depiction of somebody having their own head cut off. As that Overton window shifts, the genre shifts with it to try to continue to shock and surprise and entertain people. And what ends up happening is now that, film is more than 100 years old, 120 years old now, you start to see the mixing of genres. So I think you touched on this a little bit, Gov, with your comments on are we going to remake this or not? Well, yeah, that's why now you see, Halloween or Texas Chainsaw Massacre is getting remade today, using a lot of the same themes from the splatter films of the early 2000s, that same level of violence, that same level of physicality, that same level of human vulnerability is being taken advantage of there.
Well, I definitely agree that the stakes have to be raised since these films, because now we've seen how graphic can be.
Exactly.
So if you want to play the game, you gotta, switch up your strategy.
I think there are multiple ways to switch up your strategy. I think that there is something about the old Gothic horror film. I mean, I just went back and rewatched Nosferatu, and that is a disturbing film. I mean, it is a very unnerving film, and then you realize it's this German film from a century ago. There's no speech lines. Nobody does any talking. And the silence is deafening. You can hear the record crackling during the film, and that adds a certain level to it. I mean, I think there's multiple ways that you could go into it, but the question is, what is going to maintain the attention of the American population today, right? And it's not going to sit through the first 30 minutes of Nosferatu to get to the good part. Today, it has to be plot driven. It has to be exploitative, because it's all about being a business. I think the art is starting to get sucked out of it because it has to be profitable. And the good news is that a lot of indie films can't afford to do the type of special effects that the big films set the standard for consumer demand, right? If Superman doesn't actually look like he's blasting through the building, then everybody's like, and they completely check out. They can't, willfully suspend their disbelief anymore. So, I think good indie people are having to go back to a lot of the old techniques that are used to disturb, because if we don't really think that person's head is getting cut off, then, we're going to check out. We're going to be unable to willfully suspend our disbelief, which is really what's needed, especially in a genre like horror.
So basically what you guys are thinking or are saying is that you don't think there's any more room in an American audience for using your own imagination, implied horror and implied threats.
So coming from the Halloween guy, who like the suggestive scares, the shadows, and the what you don't see is better.
To be fair, that's the kind of horror that I enjoy. That's one of the reasons why I like Alfred Hitchcock films, is because it mind fucks you.
No, I mean it's valid form of horror. Don't get me wrong, but at the same time, are we numb to it at this point because we've
because we're overexposed.
Because we've seen everything.
We're overexposed.
Especially with these kind of movies. All right, I watched, a girl have her face melt off with a blowtorch. You don't really
I'm gonna try to add to the growing pile of ridiculous and controversial statements I've made during this. If Alfred Hitchcock was alive and making films in 2005, he would make a splatter film. You rewind the clock back to 1963 when Psycho came out. It was the first film in film history to contain a toilet in it. It was the first film to depict that level of violence the way that it did. It addressed an extremely disturbing topic, which had been in the news in previous years for the first time because mass communication became a thing, right? Until World War II, mass communication wasn't even really a thing. So he was on the I'm not even going to say the cutting edge. I'm going to say the bleeding edge of horror. He had crossed the line, and there was a huge controversy in his time over the rating it was going to get, whether it could get rated, whether it would get banned, whether it could be released or wouldn't. He had to make all kinds of edits to it. He killed the protagonist of the film and the first half of the movie. That's something that had really never been done before. Oh my God, what are we going to do now? You know, he, in my opinion, was all about being on the bleeding edge. It just so happened that the Overton window was in a very different place in the 1950s and 60s than it was in 2005. And as a result of that, we got something that was entirely different. But if the Overton window had been switched or whatever, you know, he was always about being on that edge, though. He was always trying to do something new and edgy and different. And he did it in Vertigo. He did it in Rear Window. He did it in South by Southwest. And by God, he did it in Psycho.
I'm not going to disagree with you because I completely agree with you that the man was revolutionary and he did push limits. He really did in the best way possible. I really believe if it wasn't for Alfred Hitchcock, we wouldn't have what we have today as far as horror, thriller movies, suspense movies, mystery, anything like that. I don't think if he were alive today, it would be really weird because the man would be super, super old. I don't think he would do the splatter films solely because in his later years, they asked him about his level that he was at. And he was quoted as saying, there is nothing more terrifying than the human mind. What you don't see, your brain will warp in a million different directions. What's the point of ruining a surprise if you already get to see what's inside? So Alfred Hitchcock was so into the idea of, I'm going to let you freak yourself out just by a simple suggestion, something you don't necessarily have to see. So that I'm going to disagree with you.
Do you think that Alfred Hitchcock would have done the same thing that he did if a movie like Psycho had been made in 1925?
Are you saying like as
I'm
far
just
as
saying
like
that
pushing
we
a limit or like what
we
he
can't,
showed?
What do I want to say? We can't create a time traveler scenario. We can't take Alfred Hitchcock, you know, and plop him in 2005, just completely take him out of 1960 and plop him into 2005.
Yeah. You know what? The Bill and
that
Ted
would be
can
entertaining.
do it, damn it. I can't.
But I think that, you know, dude.
Watch Bill and Ted end up in
you know, well, death is in it. I mean, no, you know, there's a part that'll be our next conversation. Is Bill and Ted a splatter film? Each.
Yeah, there you go.
You know, I think that the Overton window was in a particular place, and if you were to try, the only way to really try to understand if he would be, I just think he was more defined by being on the cutting edge, and at that time, the techniques that he was implementing, the thoughts that he was having, the idea of using the psychology of the human mind against itself, that was considered cutting edge. He didn't have great special effects, so he had to work with what he had, and what he did was brilliant, right. And it laid the foundation for what we ended up getting 45, 50, 60 years later. But if you were to push everything back 40 years behind then, and you were to say, okay, well, what if Psycho was made by a different director, the exact same movie, but it was made in 1920 instead of 1963, what would Alfred Hitchcock be doing in 1963? And I assure you, it wouldn't be anything like Psycho. It would be something entirely different because the Overton window would have shifted dramatically from where it was.
Right. I think
you don't. This is what I think. I think that you don't really like splatter films, and so you can't imagine your favorite director doing it.
I enjoy splatter films, so take a step back for half a second, okay?
There you go, Jeremy.
Take a half a step back for a minute, because I do enjoy them. I don't consider them necessarily a humongous subgenre. And I'm not saying that even splatter films are a display of a lack of imagination, because you can't get creative with it. What I'm saying is The allure of a mind fuck, in my opinion, is more powerful than watching somebody get their intestines ripped out. And of course, that also is up to interpretation and the individual. Just because somebody can stomach one thing and another person can't, that's up to the individual person. I just think a mind fuck with a suggestion is more powerful.
Which, in your opinion, which one raises? I mean, do you think that seeing the actual physical graphic depiction of violence raises the stakes? Do you think the stakes are higher in a film like The Green Inferno or Saw than they are in Psycho or Rear Window or anything like that?
Well, I think they're different. I think the stakes are slightly
higher,
different.
though? I mean, I'm
you're
asking
working
specifically
with two
about them. Are
different
they
animals.
higher?
No, I really don't think so. Either way, you have a human being who is in a vulnerable position, and one way or another, they're being killed.
So you're saying that there's no distinction between the way that Norman Bates commits his murder and the way that our victims die in Hostel? You're not drawing a distinction between getting stabbed 10 times in the shower and dying in 30 seconds and being tied to a chair in a dark room and tortured with a drill, and you don't think those stakes are higher?
No, I definitely think that there is a different distinction between them. Obviously, I mean, you even just depicted in detail yourself the difference between them. What I'm saying is, I guess it depends on what the viewer is drawn to, what they're looking for necessarily, I guess is what I'm saying.
I mean, I guess it breaks down to what's more scary to you. Are you, is it more vulnerable to be alone showering and then somebody comes into the room,
right?
Versus you're strapped to a chair. Yes, you're in a vulnerable position. You can't go anywhere, and you pretty much have to watch yourself get mangled. But what's scarier, what you don't see or what you do see?
And again, that goes back to what I was saying about that goes back to the individual. Because trust me, I thoroughly enjoyed.
I mean, they're both horrific ways to die, guys. But are you really telling me that you think that there's an equal level of terror between getting eaten by a shark in Jaws and being captured by elite hunting and Hostel, or having your plane crash and being captured by cannibals in the Green Mile? I mean, I think I'd much rather be eaten by a shark, for the record, Lord Jesus. If I must go, have Jaws eat me, please. I mean, am I understanding what you're saying correctly? That you'd just as rather get eaten by a shark or as be eaten by cannibals? I guess I'm speaking to you, Quinn, because you're the one that seems to be saying that it's all about perspective, but it seems to me like everyone's perspective on this one would be pretty unanimous, that you'd rather be stabbed to death 12 times and die in less than a minute in Psycho than, be captured by elite hunting and be hung upside down naked to be scythed by an old woman so that she can bathe in your blood. I mean, it seems to me the stakes are higher there pretty uniformly.
And again, I think it goes back to interpretation.
All right. Okay.
All right. Well, let's the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All right. Very similar in content, I think, when it comes to like a movie like Hostel. It's very basic. Group of friends, they show up and now they're being pursued and tortured. Which movie would you agree is more scary? Hostel or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? If you bring it up to the level, I'm not talking about the remake, because here's the thing. The original
Yeah, there
Texas
was-
Chainsaw Massacre was
Yep.
absolutely terrifying, and there was no blood in it, dude.
Yep.
Everyone like you take the meat hook scene.
Yeah.
Everyone swears that they saw the meat hook go in the back. It never does.
What would I say on that? I think that there is a grittiness to that film that you're right. It definitely stays with you. As far as which one is scarier, yeah, absolutely. And in my personal opinion, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a scarier film. And I would say that probably, in my opinion, the scariest horror film that I've seen is House of a Thousand Corpses, the zombie film, which fits in that same type of genre, except the themes from Texas Chainsaw Massacre that terrified you, and it raises the stakes by using a lot of the same splatter film techniques that we've been talking about here. But I agree that there's a polished way that the Hostel film is shot that sort of takes away from it a little bit. In addition, I think that because it was marketed very differently, especially to people of our generation that were, in high school and college at the time that it came out, you knew what you were getting into. A lot of people that went to Texas Chainsaw Massacre knew they were going to a scary movie, but didn't know what they were getting. They didn't know that they were getting something much more exploitative than what it was. And as a result of that, that created a shock value to it that doesn't exist with a film like Hostel. Once you see it once, you can't unsee it. And it'll never be as scary as it was the first time, right? Because you know what's going to happen. That's true in both instances. But I think that there's a grittiness to that film. There's a rawness to that film that definitely takes it to a new level, which is why I think a lot of the foreign films tend to be a lot scarier than a lot of the domestic films, because the budgets are lower and there's a grittiness to it, and it forces the actors to do a lot more work and to be a lot better, because you can't get away with everyone being distracted by all the great special effects that we can pay for. So I would agree with you. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a scarier movie than Hostel.
You bring up a really interesting point that I want to touch upon, and that is rewatchability. And I feel like that something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or any of the, figurehead slashers, whether it's Hellraiser, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, whatever, I think they have much more of a rewatchability than, say, a Hostel. Only because, kind of like what you say, once you've seen it the first time, get over that initial shock. It's
yeah,
done.
I think that
Really
I think at least personally myself, for me, rewatchability only makes sense for the first, let's say, 3 times. Once you get beyond 3 times, it has way more to do with personal taste than it has anything to do with the themes or the content or the acting or the cinematography or any one of the other technical aspects that we might sit around talking about. I don't think there's very few films out there that the cinematography is actually so good that you would just watch it for the amazing cinematography. I can only think of one, and that would be 1917. I'd watch that thing 1,000 times because the cinematography is just unbelievable in it. But so I think the real question is, okay, are you willing to watch it 3 times without, just on your own, right? You're just on your own. To me, there are very few films that I wouldn't watch 3 times, just because I think in 3 times you can learn enough new stuff after 3 watches to learn something new, to find some new extra layer of interest, to discover some Easter eggs that you didn't see before, all that kind of stuff. From a rewatchability standpoint, I think that for me personally, just there's so much more detail and there's so much more intricate special effects. And, I went back and watched the Hostel film. I've seen it a whole bunch of times. I still get that anxious feeling. As a matter of fact, I get it even earlier than I did before because I'm starting being like, no, don't go in there. They're going to get you. Don't go in there, because you know what's going to happen. But long term, the rewatchability
you're a
isn't like, I
fanboy.
watched it on Tuesday and then I watched it on Wednesday and then I watched it on Thursday. It doesn't have that type of cycle to it. You got to put some space in between it. There has to be something nostalgic about it in order for you to go back. But I agree with what it seems like you're implying at Gov, which is that the rewatchability isn't as high for the exact same reasons we've been talking about throughout this entire conversation, right? You can't, it's like a firecracker. It burns really quick. There's a really intense half-life in it. And if you were to watch it 3 or 4 times, 3 or 4 nights, you'd never watch it again because you'd be done with it. There'd be nothing else to explore.
I got one last question, and I'm actually going to throw it at Ace because I just wanted to see his reaction. Splatter film.
You stole it. I was going to say that.
Splatter.
I know you have.
Really? And you know what? I've been waiting all day to bring it up too.
It's your chance. Go ahead.
Boy, that's that's tough because like we were talking about, how it dips its feet into a bunch of subgenres. So yeah, I can definitely see it as a splatter film, but I can also see it as a straight slasher. I mean, obviously, cutting a woman in half from veg to head, definitely, and showing it definitely makes the case that it is a torture porn splatter film.
While her friend watches.
Yeah. Exactly. I think what separates Terrifier from, say, like a Hostel or the later Saw movies is the Art the Clown character himself and how he plays with the victims and sets the victims up like a traditional slasher would, like a Michael Myers would. I think that really sets it apart from just a straight let's gross you out. I think the character of Art the Clown changes things.
So you're calling it a splatter film with an icon?
I think it's definitely exploitative in nature. There's a lot of, but I don't think, again, I think that there are definitely graphic natures, but it would appear to me that the film itself does not, again, it's a good splatter film has to revolve around almost the fascination with the vulnerability of the human body. And Art the Clown, I don't think does that. I think it leverages a lot of the same techniques. I think it's terrifying and wonderful and scary, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of it. But because the story itself doesn't wrap around the vulnerability of the human body, I don't think it fits. I don't think it quite fits the splatter film genre.
Okay, well, we just hit 1 hour here, so one last question before we wrap this up. Do you ever think the splatter film or torture porn will ever see mainstream success like it did with Hostel and with Saw ever again? Or do you think this is something that kind of stays on the streaming services?
Yeah, I think it's dead.
Special audiences.
Or if it's not dead, it's on life support, and someone just needs to pull the plug. I think, and I don't think it's coming back. You might see in the future some homages. When people our age or maybe a little bit younger become financially successful and they want to do a passion project. I'm thinking about like Quentin Tarantino's Grindhouse and Death Proof and those types of films. We might see a good homage down the road. But I think that I think it's dead, and I think that that's a good thing because there's only so much there's only so much you can exploit this genre and actually get good content out of it. So I think it's dead, but I don't think that's a bad thing.
And there you have it. Torture porn. What do you guys think?
Well, like I said in it, I guess I'll live with the term splatter films because I hate the torture porn or the Gorno thing. It just doesn't sound right to me. But I do like hearing from somebody who is really into it. You don't meet a lot of those guys.
It's very rare.
Yeah, it's kind of a, in my opinion at least, a black mark on the horror genre. I mean, in terms of mainstream, it came, it went. No one's really talking about it anymore.
Yes, this is definitely a unique topic, especially for us. We don't really cover films like this. So once again, I want to thank Jeremy for his time. And again, if you guys want to hear more of Jeremy's opinion and insight, you can find him as a frequent guest on Just My Opinion with Ken Lambert right here on Anchor. But on to the next. Gov, what's next?
Well, Halloween season is amongst us, and I would like to dust off one of the Halloween classics that has a lot of debate about it because it's quite literally a boxing match on film, and that would be Freddy vs. Jason.
Ooh, Quinn?
On Scarifyer. Let's get back to the movies.
Quinn, how you feeling about that? You ready to take on Freddy vs. Jason?
I'm actually really giddy about it. I know that sounds super ridiculous, but I'm ready. I love that movie.
There's been a lot coming out about the film. More importantly, a book that was just published that really details the production. So I'd love to get into that. Yeah. And, of course, the movie itself.
All right, Psycho, so there you have it. Next week, Traditional Scarifyer back to doing a movie review. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Scarifyer.